Okay, go ahead there, John.
Right. Well, welcome everybody to this afternoon's lecture. I'm delighted that we've got Guy Beiner to talk to us on Lost and Found in Search of the Memory of Spanish Flu. And why would we need to find the memory of Spanish flu? I think we need to remember what a colossal event it actually was. I think I'm right in saying that during our pandemic, so far, 2 million people have died. There's no precise calculation of how many people died in the Spanish flu, or so-called Spanish flu, but I have seen estimates that range from at the bottom end, 20 million, possibly 50 million, and indeed possibly 100 million, more than died in the Great War, about which we go on endlessly. So why did it get forgotten? And are there any lessons we could learn from it? Well, it's over to Guy. You're very welcome.
Thank you very much. And it's great to see such a large crowd here. Yeah, and I see that Ida Milne, who's the real expert in Ireland on the topic, has already greeted me on my new look. This is the lockdown look. I've been in lockdown forever. I can't remember when I left home, except for today, when I managed to make it into university, got permission to use their internet for this talk. So it's great to be here today. It's great to be with Reclaim the Enlightenment, a group which I have always have time for. It's a group which I really appreciate and think are doing a great work. And so when I was invited to give this talk, I couldn't say no, even though I'm a bit pressured with other things at the moment, but I really couldn't say no. I should say in advance, I'm going to be talking less about Ireland in this talk. I'm going to be talking globally on purpose. I might say a few pointers about Ireland. There's relevance about Ireland, it might come up in the discussion, but like I say, there's far greater experts than myself on Ireland. Ida Milne, who's in the group today, is definitely one of them. Patricia Marsh, whose book is going to be coming out soon on Ulster during the influenza epidemic with Palgrave Macmillan, is another great expert. So there's plenty of experts on Ireland. I'm going to try and give us a larger view, and I'm going to try and focus on things that interest me in particular, which I think should concern all of us. And these are questions of memory and forgetting. For those who are familiar with my work on Ulster, for example, or any other thing that I've written, my work always tends to hover towards issues of remembering and even more forgetting. And so, without further ado, I'm going to show you a PowerPoint. I might stop at certain times so you won't only be fixed on a PowerPoint, and I'll lead you through the topic and we'll see where it'll take us. I've got quite a few things to show you. I'm sharing with you material which is going to be coming out in a book, which is a volume of collected essays with leading experts from around the world on this topic of remembering and forgetting the Great Flu. We began working on this book. I began working a few years ago. We began in earnest. We had a couple of seminars and workshops about it a year and a half ago, and the book should have come out last year. And then COVID-19 broke out and everything began to change. So you'll see how even the impact of COVID fits into this talk in a way. So let's begin with that, and I'll share screens with you in a minute and we'll see how that works. Hopefully you can all see what I'm hovering around here, this picture of the title of the talk. Am I right here, Stephen? Can you all see it there? John, can you see it? Grand. The picture, for those who are not familiar with the graphic, it's an Irish caricature cartoon from the Irish Weekly Independent by Gordon Brewster, The Passing Enemy, Influenza, from the period itself. So death is stalking, walking through Ireland or the world, and everybody is dwarfed compared to this massive death. I'm going to talk for about 10 to 15 minutes, perhaps, maximum, and quickly review the history of the Spanish flu, the so-called Spanish flu. I'll do that. Had I been giving this talk a year ago, I would have needed 40 minutes for it. I might have had to give a whole talk to it. I've just finished teaching a semester course on the history of the Spanish flu, and a semester isn't enough. So we need time for it. But my assumption is that after the last few months, most of us have heard about it. All of us know something about it, And in fact, maybe this part of the talk is superfluous. So I'm just going to run through it quickly. So we'll all be singing from the same hymn page, if you wish. We'll all be on the same page just to know some of the basic facts. So we'll know, before we talk about memory, we'll talk a little about history proper. So a few basic things, and I'm sure most of this is familiar to all of you, even trivial by now. Though, again, I remind you, 9 months ago, and I'm not too sure how many in the room would have known it. And that's the interesting point. Let's start. Origins. Quite often when you talk about pandemics, you like to talk in medical history about patient zero. Where did it begin? And there are at least 3 major theories, hypotheses, if you wish, where the Spanish flu, where the Great Flu epidemic began. And these were already around immediately after the event itself. Already we can hear people write, we can read people writing these things in 1919 already, in 1920. So there's nothing new in it. Modern medicine hasn't added that much when we think about it. But what are the main theories? Well, the one is the United States, the Midwest of the United States. There's a doctor in Haskell County, right smack in the center of the United States, who's writing in Kansas, who's reporting about irregular cases of influenza already in 1917. And the theory is that perhaps this influenza infected the nearby camps once America was mobilizing for entry into World War I. And there were massive camps exactly in that area, Camp Funston in particular, which is a camp of tens of thousands of soldiers. So it rampaged through that camp in March of 1918, and from there it perhaps spread with the soldiers across America, and with the soldiers also traveled over to Europe, infected people on the Western Front, and from there people went to their respective countries, and that's one possibility of how it spread through the world. Another possibility, equally likely perhaps, is that it actually began at the Western Front. This has been pushed by various people like John Oxford in England, but the theory has been around for decades, and that is that certain British army camps have reports already in late 1916 of irregular pneumonia, bronchital pneumonia, late 1916, that it infected Aldershot camp in Britain, mainland Britain, and afterwards also we see reports in Etaples, major camp on the Western Front, a camp which has proximity to animals, which also has, it's on the main avian route, and there's also birds there. That's the moment where there might have been this moment of jump from a mutation from an avian flu to a human flu. Possibly, we don't know. And the third takes us back perhaps to the likely suspect. Every major pandemic in modern history, as far as we go back, almost invariably has started actually in the Far East. China, if you wish. And so there are reports in a province of China, also in 1918, early 1918, already in 1917, in fact, of an irregular form of influenza in a certain area of China. And then from there, if that happened, it would have traveled with what's called the Chinese Labor Corps, or as they were called in slang at the time, the coolies. The Chinese laborers, who traveled, tens of thousands of them, would have traveled from China through Canada, the United States, over to Europe to be the manual laborers of the Western Front. The people actually dug various trenches, who serviced the camp, and from there the virus could have spread equally around the world. I'm giving you these 3 theories because they haven't been solved, and I doubt they ever will be solved. One of the great disappointments, perhaps, is that after a century of research, we can't solve many of these problems. So let's put them there as options. And yet, why do we call it the Spanish flu? Well, as you can see, people at the time believed that perhaps it traveled out of Spain and traveled around the world. Here's a photograph, one of the few photographic images that we have of Spain from around the time of the Spanish flu. And yet, this is a misnomer. We should take into account that Spain was a neutral country at the time of World War I, and therefore news journalism was more lax. I'd be careful about using the word censorship. Usually the literature says in Spain there was no censorship. This is not exactly about censorship. There were reports about the flu epidemics in each country around the world. Newspapers are full of them from the very beginning. But in Spain, people could write about it more freely. It could be front page news. So when King Alfonso XIII falls ill, when his prime minister, Antonio Mauro, falls ill, when many of his ministers, other ministers in the cabinet fall ill, this is first page news. When the theaters closed down, when the post office is closed, this is all mentioned. Whereas in other countries, there was more of a stoicism to it. Let's try not to play the flu, let's play down the flu so as not to hurt morale during the war. That's how I would put it rather than censorship. And so the name sticks, Spanish flu. At least from May, we can see such papers as ABC, as El Sol, Spanish newspapers publish, and this is picked up in other places. So if we look, for example, at the Times, the London Times, we'll see already in June, everybody thinks of it as the Spanish influenza today. But already then it was clear to medical experts that it wasn't Spanish influenza. We should be clear about it. Even in this newspaper from the Washington Times from October, if we look at it carefully, it says the miscalled Spanish flu. Rupert Blue, who was the Surgeon General in America, if you wish that, Anthony Fauci of his day, would issue every week a public bulletin to health officials around America. This would be published in newspapers and in magazines and would be also reproduced in various places in Europe. And he writes very clearly already in September 1918, there's no reason to believe that it originated in Spain. A few months later, he'll write it didn't originate in Spain. So people at the time knew that it wasn't really a Spanish flu. And yet, as we know today, misinformation travels very quickly. And the name stuck to it. It's viral in a different sense. It became a meme, if you wish. Even more than that, it even assumed a gender identity. The notion of the Spanish lady enters into popular culture, into folklore. You can see it here, for example, in this caricature from a German caricature, the Spanish Krankheit, the Spanish disease, but the flu is presented as this kind of Spanish woman who's there to seduce you, to contagion, as she passes the angel of peace and brings death all over the world. And she's a monstrous character. And in some languages, it's very clear. It's enough to say the Spaniard, but the Spaniard is in the feminine, as in Slavic languages, Hispanka. In the Hispanic languages, it's clear that we're not just talking about a Spaniard, it's a female Spaniard. And so the name gets this kind of folk image of the Spanish lady. The flu, the epidemic, or pandemic to be more precise, spreads all around the world. And we can see its roots traveling all around the world. And this happens in three major waves. Again, I assume you know most of this. I'll run through it quickly. The three waves, and here I'm looking at seasons as they're known in the Northern Hemisphere. But of course, it's the opposite in the Southern Hemisphere. And it happens more or less simultaneously everywhere, more or less. The first wave would be in spring, summer of the Northern Hemisphere of 1918. Earliest places received it in February, March, maybe even in January, but February, March into May, June. This is a chart in England, so it's June, July particularly hits England heavily. The second wave would be in October, November. This is the deadly lethal wave of the autumn of 1918, which is, if the first one is considered relatively light, it's often called a 3-day fever. Quite a few people recover from it. The second one is far more mortal, far more dangerous. And then it recedes for a bit. And we have a third wave again in early 1919, which continues for quite a while. And to be precise, actually, today we know there was a fourth wave. In many locations, the flu continues to strike with a fourth wave in 1920. When we talk about its spread, we should accept the fact that it strikes all over the world more or less simultaneously with some regional variations. So large parts of Africa and South America are not hit yet by the first wave. They're mainly hit by the second wave. Australia is spared most of the first and second wave because of a maritime quarantine and is only hit badly by the third wave. But gradually it reaches every continent in the world except for Antarctica. Some of the most remote places are hit terribly. If you look here at Bristol Bay, Eskimos in Alaska, wiped out terribly. Whole communities wiped out. These are terrible situations. If you want to look how remote it is, look at this little tiny islands in the Pacific. So in the Pacific, American Samoa is not hit at all. One of the few places in the world not hit at all because they impose a very tight quarantine. But just nearby, Western Samoa, which was a German colony, which turns into a New Zealand colony at the time, is hit very, very badly. And it really reaches all these faraway places. In fact, The Lancet, one of the premier magazines of medicine, writes about the invasion of every hitherto safe nook and cranny in the inhabited world. When you see these areas of white, which seems to hint, and this is just the second wave, there's a third wave afterwards, which seem to hint that areas are not hit. That's because there aren't reports from those areas. They weren't documented. And that's part of the problem. This vast swathe of area of the Soviet Union is in the middle of a civil war. It's not being documented, even though it's quite evident that the flu hit there very, very badly. Whole areas of China are also under civil war, and different gangs are competing there. Colonial areas didn't document part of with the flu spreading in the Central Africa. So when we see these gaps, it's not because the influenza didn't reach every corner in the world. It's mainly because in certain areas, the reports are scant. And if we want to talk about its scale, in terms of mortality, well, John was mentioning how numbers have been updated throughout the 20th century. Indeed, at first people talked about 10 million, then for a long time the figure is 20 million, then updated to 30 million. Then when they realized that at least there might have been up to 20 million in India alone, in the Indian subcontinent alone, the figures now changed. Now we think it might have been 13 million in India. So the last time somebody compiled all the figures from around the world, and it's due to be updated, I believe it should be updated now, was 2 decades ago, 18 years ago to be precise, and the figure was 50 million. But, and note this, even this vast figure may be substantially lower than the real toll, perhaps as much as 100% understated. This is mad when you think about it. What kind of scientific figure is this? 50 million? Perhaps 100 million? I mean, the difference is massive. And this just shows, in a way, how after a century of research, we actually know very little. We seem to know a lot, but if we can jump from 50 million to 100 million, this is not being very scientific, is it? We should just be aware of some of these problems here as we go along. And this has been debated a lot, and people can read about it. Now there's endless information on the internet, so you can inform yourself quite easily about this. If we want to talk about morbidity, how many people are ill, then the figure is even more astronomical. If we take, for example, Neil Johnson, who was one of the people behind the earlier survey that I talked about, he talks about, this is one of the higher figures, an estimate of 1 billion people, which would have been half the global population at the time were infected in some way or other. Were infected, right? And out of them, up to 100 million may have died. So this is, at least by these estimates, the most deadly event in human history in such a short time span. Definitely more than all the deadly events of the 20th century, more than World War I, more than World War II, more than Stalin's purges, more than the Great Leap Forward in China, more than any event that you can think of. This is the great killer of the 20th century and of history in large. You have to think of the implications of that in a minute when we come to what I want to talk about, and that's memory. I should keep a watch here because I have a lot to say from now on, but a little bit more about the history of it, just so we'll know exactly what we're talking about. Characteristics. And actually, I've lost sense of the, I don't have the chat line here. I won't be seeing the chat. I'm sorry, I didn't set it up on the side here, so I'll have to inform myself later. That's just the way to set it. I didn't move it away to a different page. I've got 3 monitors here. About characteristics. Of course, the common mistake is people thinking of flu as being the common cold. It's not the common cold. Influenza is a dangerous disease, but especially the virus of 1918, the H1N1 of 1918 was especially a nasty disease. The symptoms were particularly bad. Nosebleeds, diarrhea, terrible head pains, people having hallucinations, sputum. You have this mucus filling up people's lungs. And so they drown within their own lungs. And that results in this terrible, quite unique symptom, which is the Heliotrope Cyanosis. As people before they die, not in all cases, and these are the more deadly cases, become very red, then become very purple and die. And this is shocking. I mean, people haven't seen things like that before, this kind of Heliotrope Cyanosis. Another remarkable thing is the heavy death toll, unexpectedly, of young adults. We usually expect of influenza a huge graph, as so that usually the people who are susceptible to it, of course, the very elderly and the very young babies. But what's unique about 1918, 1919, and this changes with slight variations, but it's a similar pattern. Ida, who's here, could tell you about Ireland, how it changes very small variables, but usually we see this kind of W pattern in which there's this huge spike of people between 15 to 45. The people who should have been the most healthy are hit badly. That's another of the puzzles and the conundrums of this flu. And if we go beyond this, so what does modern medicine do with this pandemic? Well, the important thing to realize is that medicine was caught helpless. Medicine didn't even know it was a virus. At the time, it was believed that it was probably a germ caused by a germ, a bacillus called the Piper bacillus, named after Richard Pfeiffer, a German bacteriologist who identified a bacillus which people thought caused the flu. And it was only in some of the cases, and it wasn't the main cause in any case. So all the vaccinations and serums and medications that people developed were practically useless. And there was a huge variety of medications on the counter and off counter, lots of folk medications, help symptoms in many ways, could alleviate you, could drink a lot of alcohol, that might help you in other senses or might do harm in other senses, but the medicine was helpless. And just to illustrate this quickly, look at this image from an American army camp, Fort Porter. I love this image because it practically says it all. You see here a doctor telling a nurse, giving her instructions. And the nurse is watching him with authority, because that's what nurses are supposed to do, and he's giving her instructions. And this picture is exactly, if you wish, one of the paradoxes of what's happening. One of the great ironies is the doctor is male, as most doctors were at the time, and is speaking with authority about something that he knows absolutely nothing about. Modern medicine had nothing to offer, practically. Whereas the nurse, most of them were females, actually had something to offer. They could help people, they could let them rest, they could make sure that they're fed well, they could make sure that there's ventilation in the area. If anybody saved people, it would be the female nurses, not the male doctors. And another area which emerges at that time, a huge awareness, is the importance of public health. Now we're all aware of public health, and it's not for nothing that I chose this poster with a female nurse giving health regulations. Quite often the nurses were at the forefront of spreading the regulations, of advertising the regulations, and also explaining and educating people about public health, about social distancing, about wearing masks, about staying at home, about not going to work, about quarantine, isolation. All these various instructions are, of course, what really helps us keep a pandemic checked or an epidemic checked. And yet, as you can see from this caricature from New Zealand, J.C. Blomfield was a New Zealand caricaturist. People felt that the politicians were desperate in this whole area. I mean, here's the Minister of Health in New Zealand. He's balancing in his nose a whole set of medications, and it's clear that he has no real help to offer to an influenza patient. So what did people see out of all of this? If we again turn to popular culture, well, famous caricatures here. One is Ernest Noble, an English caricaturist. A man sneezes, achoo. And this massive monster comes out who says, "Good evening, I'm the new influenza." And this massive monster, which knocks him off with a knock with a mallet, is how people saw it. The flu came out of nowhere. It's massive. Nobody can do anything against it. You are helpless, and you can die instantly. People died very quickly. Or if you wish, this sketch from Alfred Crosby in Germany, it looks like something from the 30 Years' War, from the Middle Ages, from the Black Plague, the angel of death going around with his scythe and killing everybody, death killing everybody, and we're helpless. So that's just quickly to run us through the history. I want to talk about memory, though, because we would have expected, of course, that an event which is so devastating, which kills so many millions of people, that everybody is affected in some way or other. Either you catch the disease, and most people, half of the people probably caught the disease. Around you see people dying everywhere. You see people suffering everywhere. We would have expected this would have become the most major event, one of the major events of the history of the 20th century into the 21st century. But that doesn't happen. And of course, we need to put this in context. And the key point to note here is this comes on the tail end of the Great War. The Great Flu, in many ways, is overshadowed by the First World War. The First World War, which immediately springs a culture of commemoration, which I don't need to tell people in Belfast about the culture of commemoration of the First World War, of all places in the world. But, so on purpose, I brought other images. So let's say Paris, the first victory march, or if you want to just remember in Dublin, if people in Ireland for a long time thought that there wasn't commemoration, of course, now we know about the memory of the First World War all over the island of Ireland. But and the great war cemeteries, there's a whole culture of sites of memory and sites of mourning, as the great historian Jay Winter talked about the memory of World War I, all across Europe and around the world in many countries. And this overshadows the memory of the Great Flu. Of course, there's many other factors locally in different places. In Ireland, we have to talk, of course, about the Irish Revolution and partition, and there's other events. But let's remember that all these other events killed less than the epidemic. The epidemic in Ireland killed more than the revolution or the Civil War, 1916, you know, these events. We've got to think about it. In Europe, the war killed more than the flu. If we just count European numbers in total, on a global scale, the flu, of course, much exceeded the war. So again, let's get back to memory. This is where the talk really begins, with your permission. We would have expected people to remember it, but that's not what happens. Historiography neglected it. And in order to just bring home quickly, I have a lot to say about this. We could talk for hours about historiography and its neglect. But just to illustrate the point quickly, let me give you one quick, rather glaring example. Let's look at these two volumes. These eventful years are two thick volumes published by Encyclopedia Britannica in 1924. Encyclopedia Britannica, this is not part of the encyclopedia, it's by the publishing house. These are two volumes in which they're trying to produce a history of the 20th century in the making. As the 20th century is still in its second decade, they want to start documenting. They're realizing this is a very eventful period. And everybody who is everybody is invited to contribute to these volumes. You have the leading experts in the world. I mean, Sigmund Freud writes about psychoanalysis. Marie Curie writes about radiology. All the great diplomats and experts, people are all writing about all the events in every field of human knowledge. H.G. Wells writes there. I mean, this is a remarkable set of books, well worth reading now. But for our purpose, what's remarkable is this. The two volumes together are almost 1,400 pages, 1,353 pages to be precise. When you read through these volumes, you will encounter again and again and again references to the Great War. It's obvious to anybody who lived through the Great War that you cannot not talk about this event. It shaped every area in every aspect, no matter if you're talking about sociology or about imperialism. The Great War is everywhere. How many references do you think, 1924, 5 years after the epidemic, the pandemic, how many references do you think are there to influenza? I'll tell you, 0, not even one, not even one. So the history of the 20th century is being written and not even one reference by people who lived through it. And this neglect will continue throughout the whole 20th century. So if we jump to the end of the 20th century and the turn of the century, and we begin looking at histories of the 20th century, and I've looked at many languages, but I'm showing you some in English here, just to look at it. So Eric Hobsbawm, the great historian, who's writing already towards the end of the 20th century, the age of extremes, no mention of the flu. William Kaler, no mention. Grenville, Ponting, Roberts, few sentences. And you can look through at the big histories which are being written at the end of the 20th century. Now this will all change, I believe. We'll get to that at the end of the talk. But if you look through all these histories that are being written, and you see that not on a national scale, not in the national histories, not on a regional scale, histories of Europe, histories of South America, histories of North America, histories of Africa, it doesn't appear there, and not in the global histories. The flu just doesn't exist. It's overlooked. And just to kind of give another illustration of historiographical neglect, historians gather and convene and talk about events that are important. That's how we generate knowledge. Do you know when the first conference, academic conference, was held on the influenza pandemic? It was held in 1998 in Cape Town on the 80th anniversary. I mean, people have been writing and thinking about the Great War all throughout the 20th century, endless conferences and seminars and courses and whatever. 80 years later is the first conference, a remarkable conference, but it's 8 years later. And that is part of the change in historiography. It's a key moment, I think, in the changing historiography. So just to give an illustration about how this forgetting works, and we can look at many examples, but I'll give you one which I think is striking. Let's take an expert in the field. Let's read together from the preface of Gina Colata's book, The Story of the Great Influenza of 1918. The book comes out in 1999. Who is Gina Colata? Gina Colata is the science journalist for the New York Times, all right? And she's an expert on health. And she writes a book about this, but she also admits that she just discovered the topic. And this is what she writes in the beginning, which I think is interesting. if anyone should have known about the 1918 flu, it was I. I put the emphasis in here, by the way. I was a microbiology major in college and even took a course in virology, but the 1918 flu was never mentioned. I also took history courses in college, with one of my favorite being a class that covered the important events of the 20th century. But although World War I was a major part of the course, the 1918 flu was not discussed. I've written about diseases and medicines for my entire career, first at the Science magazine and at the New York Times, even writing articles about influenza. But I never paid attention to the 1918 flu. I mean, this is remarkable. This is an expert who should have known, who says she didn't notice. So you could say, well, you know what, she didn't notice because, you know what, it wasn't in her family tradition, perhaps. I mean, that's a weak excuse, but that's not even true. She looks at her own family and she realizes that her own family was affected by the flu, and her husband's family was even hurt worse. The mother had been orphaned and had to raise her children by herself. Her husband's mother, the granny. So in this sense, there was every reason to write about it, and she didn't write about it. So we've got a puzzle here, which we need to figure out about memory and ignoring this massive event. This is not an elephant in the room. This is the room. How can it not have been written about? How could it not have been dealt with throughout the 20th century? Now, the point of entry into discussing this issue, I believe, should be looking at one of the great historians of the 20th century, and that is the great Alfred Crosby, who might be known to some of you, and if you're not known, you should become aware of this great historian who passed away 2 years ago. Alfred Crosby was a great historian of, a pioneering historian of world ecology, a huge topic today, ecological history. And he wrote things like the Columbian Exchange, a remarkable book. Now, Alfred Crosby, among other things, wrote a pioneering book in 1976, which he called at the time Epidemic and Peace. He took this Tolstoyan title, Epidemic and Peace. I think he was trying to grab attention because historians weren't interested in the topic. So he had to choose this bombastic title. But what the book really was about the epidemic in America in 1918. And later he changed the title to America's Forgotten Pandemic. That's how the book is usually remembered now. And what's interesting for the purpose of our talk, it's a great book for many reasons, but for the purpose of our talk is his chapter towards the end. He realizes that you can't deal with this topic without thinking, or it raises issues of memory. You just can't, you have to deal with issues of memory. And so he has a chapter in the end called An Inquiry into the Peculiarities of Human Memory. And this is what he writes here. And this is more or less summing up everything I've said so far. But Crosby already said it 50 years ago. The important and almost incomprehensible fact about Spanish influenza is that it killed millions upon millions of people in a year or less. Nothing else, no infection, no war, no famine has ever killed so many in as short a period. And yet, it has never inspired awe. Not in 1918 and not since. Not among the citizens of any particular land and not among the citizens of the United States. This inaptitude for wonder and fear cannot be attributed to a lack of information. And that's the key point. It's not that people didn't know. The destruction wrought by Spanish influenza is memorialized in reams of published statistics in every technologically advanced nation that was not in a state of chaos in 1918. So here's the problem. We have information, and yet it doesn't turn into something impressive, considered historical and memorable. Remember that, because we'll get to that at the very end. If we get to the very end of my talk, and I've got to rush here forward because I've got a lot to tell you here, when we think about how we remember things and what we need to preserve, or do we need to preserve? Or is it an issue at all of preservation? Because these are issues which we engage with now. Now, Crosby tried to explain this, and if we had a whole series of explanations, and of course, he realizes that the war is a prime factor. That for many people, this was seen as a subdivision of the war. The war grabbed attention. But he also gave other explanations. He talked about the very nature of the disease itself, the characteristics that I told you before, the fact that it struck quickly and passed away, and a year later it was gone, not to appear again for a long time, and so people could put it aside, or even the fact perhaps that it struck particularly young adults, whereas society then was much more patriarchal, so that elderly people would have been remembered more than youngers, perhaps. I'm not sure about these things. And he gave some other factors. I'll tell you the truth. A lot of my work in history has been about re-asking questions. I like to take the questions that historians ask and saying, this is the wrong question. Let's think about it again. I think the question shouldn't be why, but how. We can give many suggestions of why people forgot the flu. I don't buy into them. For every reason you'll give, I'll give you a reason why it's not so. For example, you could argue and say people remember things that have human agency. We remember wars, you remember politics, but disease doesn't have human agency. We can't remember that. Sounds convincing, but I'll give you plenty of examples throughout history where natural disasters were remembered. Let's think of a certain famine in Irish history, right? I mean, you don't need only to remember events which are caused by man, or maybe you need to politicize events which are caused by nature. As in the Irish famine, you can politicize it. That's one way of remembering it. And there's other ways, but there's different ways of looking at this issue. And so the question I would say is not so much why, but let's say what we mean. How was it forgotten? Was it forgotten? Let's not assume that a priori. Let's look a little closer and see how was this event forgotten. And even here, Crosby has something very interesting to offer for us. So let's read another section from Crosby before we move on. Remember, he's writing about America, but we're looking about this on a global scale. As one searches for explanations for the odd fact that Americans, again, we're thinking beyond America, took little notice of the pandemic and then quickly forgot whatever they did notice, one comes upon a mystery and a paradox. Americans barely noticed and didn't recall. That is exasperatingly obvious to anyone examining the histories, popular magazines, newspapers, and political military memoirs. That's what we talked about so far. I could qualify it. I think it is noticed, but let's say he doesn't inspire awe, as he said before, of the World War I era. But if one turns to intimate accounts, to autobiographies of those who are not in positions of authority, to collections of letters written by friend to friend and husband to wife in the fall of 1918, and especially if one asks those who lived through the pandemic for their reminiscences, then it becomes apparent that Americans did notice. Americans were frightened. The course of their lives were deflected into new channels, and that they remember the pandemic quite clearly and often acknowledge it as one of the most influential experiences of their lives. And this is the point. Individuals could not forget if you are terribly sick, if your parents die, if your children die, if your siblings die, if your friends die, if your partner dies, you don't forget that. The question is, what happens when it's not considered historical? Now, how do we know that people remembered this? And how do we know that it happened beyond America? Well, let me show you one way of knowing. Let me introduce you to another remarkable historian. I wanted to introduce you to two remarkable historians today, for those who don't know. Some people in the room might know them well. Let's look at Richard Collier. Richard Collier was a popular historian in the 60s, 70s. He actually wrote quite a lot afterwards, but he might not be familiar to many people today. And Richard Collier realized, as he wrote his first books in the 1960s, that he was a popular historian, wasn't an academic. One thing that would help sell his books, one thing that appealed to popular publics, to a general readership, was if he weaved inside the narratives human stories. And so he interviewed people and he collected personal testimonies. And he began by writing histories of World War II. He had lived through the war. So he wrote a book about Dunkirk. He interviewed and collected testimonies from 1,000 people. And so the book is full of these personal stories. He wrote a book, for example, on the Battle of Britain. He himself had been a pilot in the Battle of Britain. He interviews over 400 people, men and women, and weaves these stories in his books. And this time and time again in his books. And then in the 1970s, he decides to write about the influenza, which hadn't been written about popularly before. Well, to an extent it had. We've got to see what had been and hadn't been. And so he puts advertisements in papers around the world. He's not an academic at a university. He does this by himself. He puts advertisements in papers around the world. Here's one example from a paper in California, but you find these advertisements around the world. And let's just read for a minute what's in the ad. I'll make this larger so you can read it. I am anxious to establish contact with anyone who has memories of this time, doctors, nurses, health visitors, sufferers or their descendants, whether they have a tale to tell or have preserved letters, diaries, documents, or photographs of the period. Wait a minute, I'm going to try now for a moment. I've got instructions here I can put aside for a minute to chat. I'm hoping I can get the chat out. Yeah. No, I lost the chat again. So I don't know how to see the chat at the side. I'll have to see it later. I'm sorry, I can't see your comments. It troubles me, but I can't. I didn't set it up in the beginning. But you can see these ads going up, and he wants to get personal testimonies from people. And what was the result of somebody putting ads around the world in newspapers? Was the results when we consider he did it by himself. Today, to do such a project, even in Ireland alone, As Ida can testify, Ida Milne, or other people can say in other countries, you need a team of people, you need money, you need support, you need institutions to do it properly. He did this by himself, self-funded. The result is remarkable. In the book that he wrote a narrative out of this, a narrative collected of many stories. That's how he wrote his histories. The book was called The Plague of the Spanish Lady. First came out in 1974. A later edition comes out later. He had over 1,700 testimonies from around the world. 1,708, I'm sorry, from 29 different countries, personal testimonies, and another 62 testimonies from family members later on. This is remarkable, quite remarkable. And just to give you an idea of, I'll just show you a page from his index at the end when he's indexing the people of which countries they come from. And they came really from all over the world. I mean, with preferences for certain countries, he worked harder, but he hired translators from around the world. And now I can finally see the queue, and I'm putting them to the side here. Sorry about that. If you look around the world, what do you have here? You have Norway, USA, Germany, France, Italy, Canada, Belgium, South Africa, Denmark, Sweden, Australia, Italy. This is just one page, random. England. I think I mentioned Canada already. Let's go down, place which we haven't mentioned. Palestine. So from all over the world, you have people writing him personal testimonies from the time, right? And he's collecting these testimonies. Now, this is where this is where I begin to bring in some theory. And this is where I begin to put these things together. What happened if people would have followed him? Well, some people did follow him. Most historians didn't treat this work seriously. For most historians, this was considered anecdotal. This is not real history. This is before people developed an awareness to the importance of oral history in many ways. Alfred Crosby himself, the great historian Alfred Crosby, never referred to Richard Collier, never thought it worthy of even adding a footnote about him, which is quite remarkable because the book comes out 2 years ahead of Crosby. But a couple of people who did pay attention. So, a young historian in New Zealand, Jeff Rice. These are all elderly people now who are the leading experts in the world on the influenza, but this is the beginning of their career. Jeff Rice is a young historian at the University of Canterbury in New Zealand, reads Richard Collier, says, that's interesting. I'm going to try and do the same thing over here. He goes over to old people's homes and begins interviewing people, collects 110 testimonies from survivors. At the same time, a doctoral student, a PhD student in Cape Town, South Africa, Howard Phillips, brilliant historian. Howard Phillips goes around interviewing people around South Africa. He hires translators as well, so he can get to different people. So he can get to Afrikaners and whites and blacks all around Africa, different languages, 150 testimonies from survivors. This is in the late 70s into the early 80s. So if people had asked, if people had collected, if people had did what they did with the Great War, collected archives of testimonies of veterans, we would have had now tens of thousands. We know that memory survived. What do we see from all this? That memories were retained in traditions of families and local communities, but they didn't receive official recognition. There was no commemoration. We have to think what we mean by memory. And this is what I refer to in various contexts, including in a context which I've spoken before to your group yourselves. In my work on 1798 in Ulster, is what I call social forgetting. Social forgetting is not collective amnesia. It's not about pressing delete and forgetting everything, not at all. What social forgetting is, as I define it, it's about this tension between public silence, this veil of forgetting, and private and local recollections which exist below the surface. Like I said, I've talked to Reclaim the Enlightenment before about this topic on a very different topic, much closer to home. Here I'm talking on a global scale about social forgetting. We're talking about the fact that people had stories, communities remembered, individuals remembered, but society didn't allow this to develop into a social memory. And therefore, there's also a problem because memory to exist needs a social context, needs to be rehearsed, needs to be recognized. That's how it's played. That's how it works. All right, so this is part of the catch. Now, just to show you how much this is a catch, look at when these testimonies were collected. 78-81, Rice and Phillips are collecting testimonies, and look at when it's published. 2018. They collected these testimonies, and yet nobody was interested in reading these testimonies, or these publishers didn't think it worthy. We had to wait for the centenary for this to come out. And that says a lot. People for years had Collier's book available, but it was seen as an anecdotal book. Let's read something more serious. This is not serious history. And that says a lot. And just to see this tension between historians and how they work with it, let's take another example of a great historian, who I think is one of the great historians of the 20th century, but here got it completely wrong. Let's look at William McNeill. William H. McNeill, president. He had been president of the American Historical Society, Historical Association, a leading history of world history and of various types of history. And yet it's interesting. As he wrote years later, this is in 2000, he explains he himself came from a family that had suffered from flu. Both his parents had been ill. His mother had been ill as she gave birth to a baby who suffered health problems afterwards. He had just been an infant at the time. And yet, it was an experience so searing that my parents almost never spoke about it afterward. When the epidemic faded away, medical men, popular memory, and professional historians agreed with my parents and tried to forget the whole thing. The flu of 1918 disappeared from the world and from public memory. Now, I mention this because let's look at McNeill himself. McNeill became an historian who specialized in epidemics. He wrote one of the important books on the topic. In 1976, the same time as Alfred Crosby, he wrote Plagues and Peoples, a history of epidemics and societies. 2 brief mentions of influenza, and he doesn't make much out of it. Later on, he wrote the chapter in the Oxford History of the 20th Century on disease and demography. No mention of the flu. When he retired, this historian, who was one of the great historians, he retired in 2005. He was the general editor of an encyclopedia of world history. He had a team of people working for him, senior editor, 5 volumes, no mention of the flu. So even people who came from families of it, even professional historians, even people who specialized in disease and in pandemics and in plagues could ignore this disease, which is quite remarkable. And here again, social forgetting and how historians are part of social forgetting. They're not the only factor, they're part. But I want to add something else. For those who read my book on Ulster, you already know the term social forgetting. Let me add you another term, add to your vocabulary another term, which I've used since then more and more, and it'll appear more in this book, which is coming out. And that is cultural forgetting. Let me define for you cultural forgetting. People like to talk today about cultural memory. It's the key word in memory studies, cultural memory. And I have a problem with cultural memory because people neglect or don't notice that it really involves a lot of cultural forgetting. What is cultural forgetting? It's about exclusion from the canon. It's about neglect of works which are considered minor. If we find a book that nobody reads, if we find a picture that nobody looks at, that's not an example of memory, it's an example of forgetting. Let me give you an example. Very briefly, and I could show you again examples from around the world in this case. Let's look at the literature of the lost generation, the famous generation which formed the canon of American literature of the 20th century. Did they deal with the Great Flu? Well, if we look carefully, we'll find that many of them did. We'll find works. Catherine Ann Porter, perhaps the best of them all, wrote this novella, Pale Horse, Pale Rider, well worth reading. You'll find it on the internet, read it. It's one of the, probably the best literary work that I'm aware of, written about the influenza of 1918. She herself suffered and she writes this semi-autobiographical novella. Other people, John Dos Passos, an important writer, it appears in 2 of his works, at least, 3 Soldiers in 1919. Willa Cather won a Pulitzer Prize for one of ours. Thomas Wolfe, who lost his brother, wrote a book, Look Homeward, Angel. William Maxwell, who lost his parents, lost his mother. They came like swallows. Mary McCarthy, Memories of a Catholic Girlhood, lost both her parents. But why do I call this cultural forgetting? Because these books did not make the canon. When we think of the canon of the lost generation, we think of Faulkner, we think of Hemingway, we think of all these great names. And the remarkable thing is that each one of those authors had reason to write about the flu. They experienced in different ways. Let's take Hemingway, for example, just one example. Hemingway volunteered as an ambulance driver in Italy. His girlfriend, Agnes von Kurowski, deals with flu patients. And yet it doesn't appear in his famous novel. It doesn't appear in Farewell to Arms, which is all about that. Where does it appear? It appears as a note tucked away in one of his short stories. In a natural history of the dead, you can see that he was affected by the flu. He writes, the only natural death I've ever seen outside of loss of blood, which isn't bad, was death from Spanish influenza. In this, you drown in mucus, choking, and how you know the patient dead is at the end, he turns to be a little child again, though with his manly force, and fills the sheets as full as any diaper with one vast final yellow cataract that flows and dribbles on after he's gone. This gruesome note, which in later editions turns into a footnote. It's even removed. So he doesn't turn it into the topic of any of his novels. And I can give other examples about this. If we want to look at art, for example, the great artworks of the 20th century, how many of them are devoted to the great flu? Many are devoted about the war. We've all seen exhibitions of the great artworks of the war. But what about flu? Well, if you look, you'll find the pictures. And some of them are even drawn by some of the great artists, which is remarkable. John Singer Sargent, the American artist who came to England and afterwards also worked as an artist of the First World War. He went to the front and even was sick with the flu in the front and ended up in a hospital tent, drew a painting of the interior of a hospital tent, which we know from records in France is a hospital tent of people sick with flu. The brown blankets are those who are still suffering, the red are those who are recovering, or the opposite, I can't remember. And yet, the picture doesn't mention flu. It doesn't say flu. Those who are not aware don't know that it's about flu. Egon Schiele, the great expressionist Austrian artist, his wife, Edith, dies of flu in October during the deadly second wave. And as she's dying, he draws this portrait, or he finishes this portrait, which she began before. She was pregnant. This is a family that never existed. This is a child that was never born. This is how the family should have lived. And by the end of the second wave, he himself dies. This is a family that never lived. And again, this was never seen as an iconic picture for years of the great flu. Edvard Munch, the great Norwegian artist, has two paintings of has a few sketches. He also has a few sketches of self-portrait after the Spanish flu and during the Spanish flu. You see him here, looks withered. You're not quite sure if he has the flu or not. People even suggest maybe he didn't have the flu and he's just using it for advertising. It's not clear. But the bottom line is we have these paintings by great artists, but these are not their canonical works. When we think of Edvard Munch, we think of The Scream. We don't think of these paintings. So we have social forgetting and we have cultural forgetting. Again, cultural forgetting, I'll explain, is about things being pushed into the margin. They don't make the canon. They don't make the A-list. We have social forgetting. It's about public silence about these issues. What about rediscovery? So allow me in the next 10 minutes, and then I'll try and end, to talk briefly about how this topic is recovered. This is the found. We talked about the lost. Let's talk about the found. And here we need some theory as well. So for theory, I thought I'd bring you Patrick Zilberman. Patrick Zilberman is a professor of history of health in Paris. Remarkable in some things that he writes. And he talks about exactly social forgetting without using the terms. And he says, influenza, was it forgotten? It probably was not fully forgotten, but it was never commemorated. But then he says, there is nothing like the definitive forgetfulness of modern influenza epidemics. People usually forget very logically and very naturally past flu pandemics during the interpandemic periods. This is a phenomena, by the way, the doctors complain about. Exactly after a pandemic is when you should draw conclusions. That's exactly when nobody wants to hear about it, right? So that's what's called post-pandemic amnesia. But they don't need professional historians to remind them to consider ancient flu outbreaks. When a new one afflicts them, it takes a new epidemic, not a new history book, to reawaken memories of past epidemics sleeping in the collective family and individual memory. You can see where I'm going with this. A new epidemic awakens past pandemics. But I'm not going to jump to the obvious. I'm going to take you for 10 minutes through a tour of the 20th century in a different way. So, when was the first global history of the flu written? Before Alfred Crosby. Alfred Crosby wrote about America. It was actually written earlier. It was a small booklet by Charles Graves called Invasion by Virus. Who's Charles Graves? Charles Graves is a journalist, right? Popular works. Charles Graves, by the way, is the brother of Robert Graves. When we talked about cultural forgetting, I could have given you the example of the great war poets, Find me a Spanish flu influence in reference in Wilfred Owen or Rupert Brooke, or even Robert Graves, who was ill with the flu in Ireland. He returns, at the end of the war, he returns, he gets ill, he goes to Ireland to his family in Ireland, and he's ill with Spanish flu. He doesn't write about it. In one poem, maybe there's an allusion to it, maybe. But it's never explicit. It's not part of his canonical writing. So Charles Graves, together with a group of people, they form a small team, and they write a small booklet, which is a first global history of Spanish flu. And it's supposed to come out on the 40th anniversary. But just as it's about to come out, a new pandemic breaks out, the Asian flu of 1957. That's the title it gets, the Asian flu, the H2N2 of 1957, and publishers are scared. They don't want to publish this. It looks too frightening. So the book is not published. 10 years later, another pandemic breaks out, the Hong Kong flu of 68, 69. In each of these pandemics, by the way, 1 million people die. This time publishers want to warn the public, so they publish the book. So the book comes out 10 years later than it should, in 1968, and you can see the connection between historiography and contemporary epidemics. The concerns are not about, is this a worthy historical subject? It's about how the public will react and whether epidemics or pandemics that are spreading in the world, how they affect the writing. Let me give you another example now. Let's turn away to something else. Let's look at a pandemic which seems oh so relevant today and also scary today, maybe not relevant at all. The press doesn't like to talk about this one that much. 1976. In 1976, there was a flu scare in America. Some soldiers fell ill in Camp Devens outside Boston. The American medical establishment became really afraid of this. They believed this was supposed to be the same virus as 1918. They believed this could turn into a major pandemic. They rushed to President Ford. They bought copies of Alfred Crosby's book and handed it out to people in the White House to say how serious this could be. President Ford, who was a president who apparently did listen to scientists, now it doesn't always happen in America, decided to take this very seriously and authorized an accelerated vaccination program. Within a few months, they quickly developed a vaccination and decided to vaccinate every single American citizen. Within 10 weeks, 42 million Americans were vaccinated, just less than 20% of the population. And all the time, the press kept publishing images of Spanish flu, saying this can be like the Spanish flu. All the time, the press kept referring to Spanish flu, Spanish flu, Spanish flu. So there's a revival of memory of the Spanish flu. In the end, this ended as a fiasco because the epidemic didn't turn into epidemic. There was problems about the vaccination that people tied it to a very rare neurological condition called Guillain-Barré. It's not proven the connection at all, but the whole program was closed, hushed up quietly, and this memory was buried. So here we see a quick revival and a quick disappearance of revival. And then, here we're coming to contemporary issues. 1997, new avian flu scare, the H5N1 in Guangdong, China, as birds begin for the first time, jumps from birds to humans, and mass culling of birds. Afterwards in Thailand, and afterwards in Hong Kong, and in Vietnam. This will return again in 2003 and onwards. Massive scares. SARS, the first discovery of a coronavirus, 2002, 2003. People are afraid. 2009, the Mexican swine flu virus, H5N1. These scares are happening again and again. The WHO immediately declares 2009 as the first pandemic of the 21st century. And people begin looking for a precedence. People, what's called pandemic preparedness, to explain to the public they need to prepare. The memory of Spanish flu is reawakened. To give just one example of many examples I can give to this little cartoon book, which I really like, No Ordinary Flu, is issued in Seattle, America, in 27 languages, if I'm not mistaken, and distributed. It's a comics book. And the whole story is about a child who goes to his attic, finds a picture. And in the picture, he says, who is this? They say it's your great-granduncle. And how come I never heard about him? Well, he died of Spanish flu. What is that? And then he hears the whole story of the Spanish flu, realizes this is serious. And then they say, well, it could happen again. We've got to be careful. We've got to be prepared. So this is the great awakening of the 2000s. This is when things begin picking up. But there's also something else happens exciting at this time, and that is the dramatic story of the reconstruction of the flu virus. The dramatic story of how Johan Hultin, this remarkable Scandinavian, Swedish adventurer pathologist, goes back to Alaska, a place he had visited in the 1950s, trying to recover human tissue, and the technology wasn't there yet. He returns there. He brings back human tissue to Jeffrey Tauberberger and Anne Reed at the Walter Reed Hospital we all heard about recently in Washington at the Institute of Pathology, and they reconstruct the genetic footprint, the genome of the H1N1 of 1918. And then it's sequenced over following years. In 2005, they complete a sequence of the whole thing. We can reconstruct the virus of 1918. This major breakthrough is intriguing, it's dramatic. And this brings a major rediscovery of interest, and with it a major rediscovery of historical interest. And this is all around the world, and it has its exponents everywhere. This is where Katrina Foley's book comes out, The Last Irish Plague, which is the first Irish book on the topic. And this is when Ida Milne does her research and Patricia Marsh does her research. This is when there's this great revival and interest in this topic. And it's not only historical interest. Books begin coming out all over the world. It's a major revival in historiography, but also in popular culture. This is when books begin coming out. It's a whole separate talk if I'd have time. This is what I do. I collect this fiction. I look at it in different languages. And we're talking about titles coming out again and again and again. And documentaries begin coming out in different languages and different places. So a whole new awareness. This is rediscovery. And the rediscovery is supposed to come to its crescendo, to its peak, in the centenary of 2018, 2019. In 2018, 2019, there's conferences, new publications, exhibitions. And yet, my argument is, this is not enough to overcome social forgetting and cultural forgetting. Why does it not overcome social forgetting? Because there's a lack of official commemoration. Just to give an example close to home for most of you, if somebody wants to participate in a ceremony to honor their relatives from 1918 who died of flu, where do they go? Well, here's an example. Look at this woman over here. Rena Brian of Belfast had to go to a laying of crosses at Belfast City Hall in November 1918, which is a British Legion event for the dead of the war. And there she could remember her relative who died of flu, because that's the sites of memory that we have. We don't have sites of memory, official sites for the flu. We didn't have at least then. And the same can be said about this popular culture. All these books are coming out, but this would be considered by critics lowbrow. You don't hear about them. They're in different genres and different forms, but the books are hardly noticed for the large part. So it's a boom, but it's below the radar. So it's still about forgetting more than it is about memory. And if you look about commemoration, then where are the monuments? So many new monuments and memorial sites are dedicated during the centenary of the Great War for 4 years. The centenary of the Great Flu, where are these monuments? I can find a few when I tour around the world. Just for example, a couple. This one over here is in a cemetery in Vermont by an Italian-American who remembers his grandfather, and he sets it up there for the community. Or this one in Canada, in Regina, Canada, set up also privately. Or if you look at one in Montague in South Africa, there's a plaque set up, or different places, small local monuments, not national monuments, not big monuments. Where's the first national monument? It doesn't happen in the centenary. It happens just after the centenary. It's delayed. It was supposed to happen in the centenary. It happened not that long ago. It happened in November 2019, just a few months ago in New Zealand. The great Jacinda Ardern with Jeff Rice unveil a plaque at the National War Memorial Park in New Zealand, a 19 influenza memorial plaque. And see, so here we see memory restored. And even then, I would argue, is it really restored? One plaque, even if we tour around New Zealand, if I'd count how many memorial sites there are for Anzac, this is dwarfed by Anzac. In Australia and New Zealand, and of course, World War I memory culture will always be far larger than the influenza memory culture. And last, and this is when we get to the last bits, and I've been talking on forever, so let's try and end this here, but before that, and this is where it becomes, I'm going to bring it all home now. COVID-19. Have we entered the age of post-forgetting? Is forgetting finally over? Well, this is interesting enough. As everybody went into their first lockdown in March 2020, less than a year ago. Got to remember where we are now. It's all happened so quickly. It seems like forever. This is what happens if you look at Google searches. Ever since Google began taking records in 2004, most of the time, very little interest in Spanish flu. Even as the topic began to become a topic in the 2000s, very few searches. Small peak here in 2009 as there's an epidemic going on, also 2005 as the pandemics are happening. And then February to May 2020, boom, search engines around the world begin looking for Spanish flu to understand what's happening. How do we get a historical perspective on the pandemic that we're facing? And because of the revival of the previous two decades, then suddenly there's the literature there. There's the websites, there's the information, there's people out there to inform people. Boom, there's information out there so people can inform themselves, and it becomes a global memory very, very quickly. And if we want to look at what this does to social memory, well, to social forgetting, well, people begin looking for the centenarians, don't they? We can see this now every day in the newspapers if you look. Every time you begin looking for the last centenarians who still have the last living memory of the flu. Some of them die of COVID. And these people who for most of their life were never talked about as survivors of the flu are suddenly become survivors of the flu. Till then, they were just elderly people. Even though most people around today hardly have recollections because they were babies at the time. The people whose story should have been collected was 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, earlier. So the centenarians are suddenly recognized as flu survivors. And that's the redressal, if you wish, or the attempt at the last minute to redress social forgetting. But social forgetting is not just about the first generation. It's about second generation stories and third generation stories, putting together the pieces of how this may have appeared in households in various forms, of photographs in various houses, of family members with the person missing there who died of the flu, but people remembered them and sometimes cut out their picture from somewhere else and added to the family photograph, and various rituals and practices of remembrance in families of how it was talked about and not talked about, and has come out in various practices. Exactly the kind of work that Ida Milne does when she goes around Ireland and gives talks, and people come up to her and tell her their stories from their family. And it's remarkable stories every time. There'll be a chapter on that in the book that's coming out, and it's a brilliant chapter. So wait for that. That's a promo. And if you want to hear about cultural forgetting, well, here, let me give you another close to home example. Emma Donoghue, for those who know the Canadian Irish author. Emma Donoghue writes The Pull of the Stars. The Pull of the Stars is a book set, for those who haven't read it yet, in a maternity hospital in Dublin in 1918. She writes the book because she's inspired by the centenary. I'm sure she read Ida Milne. I'm sure she's read Katrina Foley. I'm sure she was seeing what's happening around. And then she writes this book. And as Corona breaks out, the book is completed just as Corona spreads around the world. Major publishers buy the book. It's promoted as a major book. It gets book reviews everywhere. It enters bestseller lists. For those who haven't read it, now's your chance to read it. I'm promoting a book. It's a commercial which I'm not getting anything for, so I should put there's no self-interest here. But the interesting point for me, again, this is a reversal of cultural forgetting. And now we're at the very last point I want to make as I end the talk. And I'd be love to take questions. This is the very last point here. We're talking about the memory of COVID, right? So now there's an obsession. If you look around the internet, everybody is documenting COVID-19. There are so many oral history projects, not only in Ireland. Every university in America, I've been in contact with many universities in America, they all have their oral history projects, and public libraries and national libraries and institutions and organizations. The main archives are archiving things. If it's the National Archives in London, or Luxembourg has a major place, or the Bibliothèque Nationale, or the Danish coronavirus web collection, the Internet Archive, massive documentation. So we don't forget COVID-19. Personally, I'm not worried about people forgetting COVID-19, to be honest. That's not the lesson of what I've told you here. That's the obvious lesson, but it's not. Because to tell you the truth, COVID-19 is being documented instantly without anybody lifting a finger. Why? Because of social media. COVID-19 is out there on YouTube. COVID-19 is out there on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram, for the young ones, on TikTok. You can preserve that, but it's being documented without anybody initiating an oral history project. What do I understand from these two things, from this obsession with the memory of COVID and how it relates to what I've told you now? Two things I'd like to say, and with this I'll end the talk. I'm going to say this without the PowerPoint, so I'll put up the two terms first so you see them. two terms which I used in my research. I'm going to talk about pre-memory and pre-forgetting. Let me explain these two complicated terms in 2 sentences, very briefly, but first let's end the sharing here. So I'm back on screen with yourselves now, finally. Right. The first one is pre-memory. Pre-memory is my theory, which I think is quite obvious to me, at least if you think about it, that memory of events begins before an event. As we experience an historical event, we're thinking of previous events, and that's shaping our perception of it. And that shapes how we'll remember the event. I've dealt with this with 1798 in Ireland. Now I'm looking at the pandemic. So when you think about it, the pre-memory of COVID-19 is Spanish influenza. The rediscovery of Spanish influenza and all the literature that came before that prepared people to think how we think about COVID-19. All these images of Spanish influenza are there as a pre-memory of COVID-19. Memory of COVID-19 begins before there was COVID-19. It begins with all these books coming up, which are warning us all the time. Every history book that came out in the 2000s talks about Spanish flu and always includes a consideration or a chapter of, can it happen again? And it always puzzled me. Why are historians always obsessed with, can it happen again? It doesn't happen in any other area of history. Well, here you have the answer. This pandemic preparedness, which enters into historiography, in a way prepares us. It's the pre-memory for COVID. But why do I say pre-forgetting? This is an interesting one. This is my theory that before an event happens, you might already have anxieties, or as it's happening, that we'll forget it. We don't only want to remember it, we're afraid we might forget it. We start being obsessed with forgetting even as the event is happening, even before it actually finishes. And this is interesting. So people rediscover the Great Flu. And what's the lesson of the Great Flu? It seems that the lesson is a century of forgetting. And so we already have a fear that we'll forget COVID. Now, if you ask me, all the documentation that is happening now on COVID will tell us nothing about the memory of COVID in 50 years' time. Why? Because we don't know what questions people will ask in 50 years' time. In 50 years' time, people will ask their own questions and look for their own sources. It's good that we document things, but as Alfred Crosby reminded us, remember the quote that I showed you, there was no lack of documentation on the pandemic of 1918. People decided not to look at it, right? So it doesn't tell us about what people will remember in 20, 30, 50, 100, 200 years' time. What it tells us about ourselves, we're afraid that people won't remember our pandemic. And that's part of our obsession of rediscovering the previous pandemic. And let's end at that.
Thank you very much, Guy. That was brilliant. Thank you. I think we all learned a lot there. There's a lot of very positive comments in the chat, and I think we're all grateful that you came on, and we know it's late for you in Israel, you know. One of the first questions that I can see here is from Anne Marion. My mother was born in February 1919, and her mother was one of the first surviving pregnant women who got the flu. It hit pregnant women very hard. Any comment on that there?
Well, first of all, she's right. It hit pregnant women very hard. Again, you can read that the experts on the island have a lot to say about it. Ida Milne, who I've noticed now, has written some comments and mentions, for example, the early work of Margaret O'Hogarty, which is very important, on Kathleen Lynn. About pregnant women, what I'd say is this is again one of these topics which historiography took a long time to catch up with. It's there, we have the data, we have the information. I haven't seen major studies on it proper. And that's again one of these topics, how we realize that after a century and after 2 decades now of intensive research, the field is still wide open in many ways. People have already written, it's no longer the forgotten pandemic. So much has been written about it, more than any other pandemic maybe in history, but this is the interesting point about social forgetting and cultural forgetting. You can write about it and still not remember it properly. So there's still whole pockets of areas which are forgotten, which need to be recognized. The story that you're telling there is a typical story. And yet that needs to be addressed and looked at through oral histories, through family traditions, juxtaposed with medical information and written about so it enters into the common knowledge. Because the problem with the global memory of 1918, it's a very low denominator memory. There's a common denominator which is learned on the web. It's often an American story with American images of American soldiers in hospitals. It's not the story of what's happening in Ireland or in Africa or in other places. We don't even have images of most places. And I've looked at traditions in various countries. And so the interesting thing is how to make the story richer, how to uncover these various pockets, including these personal stories which need to be recognized better.
Thank you. Francis Higgins is the next question. Guy, have you any thoughts on, in the face of all the evidence and the experience of the Spanish flu, why did Trump and Boris Johnson make so many basic mistakes that caused the lives of many?
Oh, that's a brilliant one. Well, for those who heard me speak before that, I'm going to be very wary about politics, but I am going to mention Trump. It's just too easy, isn't it? But Trump is interesting in a different way. I'm going to tell you an interesting anecdote. I'm not going to explain why he made mistakes. He made mistakes because it's Trump. You don't need me to explain why he made too many mistakes, but I'm going to talk about Trump and the flu for a different reason, which I think is interesting. There's a different way of telling my whole story now through Trump. How do I do that? I'll explain. Trump never spoke about the Spanish flu beforehand. He's never been on record talking about Spanish flu. Now, this is interesting because when it does happen, he needs an example to say, you know, this is happening. What do you want from me? He presents himself as this war president, and war doesn't work as a metaphor. So his advisors tell him, well, you know, look at Spanish flu. And he begins mentioning again and again in his speeches, this hasn't happened for a century. What do you want from me? This hasn't happened in a century. And then you look at his speeches, because it's Trump, he talks all the time about the pandemic of 1917. He gets the date wrong. And people keep correcting him. And because it's Trump, he never corrects himself. So he keeps talking about the pandemic of 1917. But why is this interesting? Because Trump's grandfather, Friedrich Trump, died of the flu in the first wave in May 1918. So the president's own grandfather died of the flu. And that's social forgetting for you. It's in the family. His father knew about it. His father's on record in the 1990s telling the story in an interview. But the grandson doesn't talk about it, is not aware of it. When it happens, doesn't show any knowledge of it. When he does, he remembers it wrong. In a way, that's another way of telling the story that I told you now. It's the story of social forgetting through somebody who was in the wrong time, should never have been in a position of power, but definitely not during a pandemic because he did everything wrong.
Okay, thank you very much, Guy. Anne-Marion has another one that's is very interesting to me as well. Seemingly lots of evidence of long-term effects among survivors, such as sleeping sickness.
All right. Yeah, please go. Keep I didn't
suppose, with the current crisis, I've got a wee girl here who got corona at the very start, and she still got it. Well, she still got the side effects, which are nearly as bad as the when she had it in the first place. No, sorry, it's not getting any better, and that's nearly a year now.
Right. So this is part of it's very important here what you're saying here. Again, I'm not going to talk about coronavirus because I'm not an expert, but it just shows that we know nothing about it yet, meaning what we think we know. We know a lot about it, but we are far from knowing the full picture. We're far from knowing what will be the after effects afterwards, how long it'll stay in our system, what will happen later. Everybody thinks we see the light at the end of the tunnel. We've got a long distance ahead of us and we don't know what's going to happen. Okay, so let's not, I'm not a futurologist, I'm an historian. But when we look back, yes, when I talked about 1 billion people infected, when I talked about 50 to possibly 100 million dead, that doesn't include possible sequelae. And there's a whole literature, big arguments in medicine about other irregular symptoms that are recorded in huge numbers immediately afterwards, for the first time, immediately after the great pandemic of 1918, 1920. Various nervous disorders. But encephalitis lethargica, the sleepy sickness, is a remarkable thing. It's a pandemic which strikes immediately afterwards of people falling into coma for years. Most people realize it from Oliver Sacks's book, Awakenings, which was turned into a movie for those who know Robert De Niro and Robin Williams. That's the reason, by the way, that we called our book Reawakenings or Pandemic Reawakenings. It's a subtle tribute to Oliver Sacks, who I think is very important in this whole area, who looks at it and says, look how these issues can suddenly be, people, coma in a way is almost a metaphor for what's happening. People fall asleep and people forget about them and they reawake later. And what's happened? And this whole notion of, it's all about what I talked about here, about lost and found. So yes, there's other effects. The story is far more complicated. I won't draw a definite line between the two because there's a whole argument in medicine about it. But the coincidence is definitely there that there's this mass epidemic immediately after the Spanish flu pandemic. So there's some coincidence happening there. And it's interesting for me in terms of memory as well.
Okay, thank you. Eamon Mahman says, what about the scientific forgetting? was there not a flurry of scientific research into the pandemic?
Very good. That's a great question. Well, when the book does come to print, what you'll see, when it comes out to the shops, what you'll see is we divide it into various sections. And one of the sections, I realized I really wanted to see memory on different levels. And one of the levels is dedicated to medical memory, exactly to the issue that you're talking about now, with key experts such as Mark Honigsbaum, who's brilliant on this topic. But what I'm saying is this: medical memory is a difficult case. On the one hand, I showed the uselessness of doctors at the time, the impotence of doctors at the time. So you have records of many doctors who say, we don't want to talk about it afterwards. You have people who, after the classic example is William Vaughn. William Vaughn, Vaughn was a key medical player in American medicine. And he was also a key player in the army at the time. And Vaughn afterwards gives this talk a few years later to nurses and doctors. And later he writes his memoirs. And he kind of glosses over the flu. He says, it happened, it was the worst thing I ever encountered, don't want to talk about it. So it's uncomfortable for them, because medicine is about presenting a model of triumph, about how medicine overcomes diseases, how it defeats one after another, it finds vaccinations for everything. And this is a huge disaster, it's a catastrophe. And even when you try to turn it into a story of triumph, it doesn't work. When James Barrie wrote his book in 2005 about America and the great influenza, he presented it as a story of triumph, but it isn't really a story of triumph, it's a story of failure. So you can see reasons to forget. But there also is a reason why medical memory remembered it, because a whole generation of biomedical scientists who experienced the pandemic during World War I dedicated their life afterwards to finding a cure, to understanding, to diagnosing what it was, to discovering the virus, to trying to find vaccinations, such as Macfarlane Burnett in Australia, who is a medical student who gets ill in one of the waves lightly and then decides to devote the rest of his life. And he'll be the person who afterwards will develop the whole chicken and egg system of developing vaccines, which was the main system of vaccines. One by one, these people will work on cracking it and working on it. So there is an inside medical memory all the time. How does this relate to my talk? I'll tell you how it relates to my talk. So there's a medical memory, but what we need are mediators who bring this to the public. And that's the balance which is always there. I gave you the example of 1976. There was a strong medical memory, even too strong in a way in America. A whole generation of people grew up with stories of this flu can destroy America. So they quickly rushed into a vaccination program, too quickly. But they couldn't quite mediate to the public what they knew about it. For that, you need the science writers. People such as James Barrie, such as Gina Colata, such as Laura Spinney. The great Laura Spinney was a great science journalist. People who haven't read her book, Pale Rider, brilliant book. And they are, in a way, players in between the historians who write the serious historical work and the scientists. You have these popular science writers who write these books where they synthesize material and bring it to all of us. And that's how medical memory is translated and becomes part of cultural memory.
Thank you. Okay, there's a long one here. Okay, I would like to ask whether you believe that the process of cultural forgetting can be linked in part to Western domination of the historical narrative. More specifically, you mentioned that the Great War was responsible for more deaths in Europe than the Spanish flu. Additionally, the 1920s, 30s, 40s are all relatively, I believe, considered eras within themselves. The Roaring Twenties, the Great Depression, World War II. Do you believe that the events just may have moved a little too quickly in the West during this period for Western cultural memory to incorporate the Spanish flu?
Okay, so it's a great question. It has to be looked at two levels. One is about Western culture, and one is about the world. I'm going to talk about the world first, we'll turn to the West. The world is more important. The world is more important on a few levels. It's not for nothing that I said that Europe, the war killed more people than just in Europe, than the plague, than the pandemic. But on a global scale, it's the opposite, because the countries which were hit worst were not Europe and were not America. Don't be distorted by COVID now that America is leading the world. The country that was worst hit, apparently, in 1918, 1920 was India. We don't even know the numbers, like I said, for the Soviet Union, for China, but there's other countries. Native American communities hit very badly. Eskimo communities hit very badly. Indigenous communities throughout the world were hit badly. What happens with their memory? I've given a lot of thought to this, but it's a different talk. I would have needed a whole talk for that separately. But when I begin looking at anthropologist reports, and it's very hard to piece together because also there wasn't the historiography, there wasn't the work, people didn't ask these questions. We begin to see that also there was social forgetting and cultural forgetting. Also there were oral traditions which didn't become part of the national narrative in various countries. In Indonesia, lots of stories told about the flu didn't become part of the Indonesian national story, mainly because there's another narrative. That's the narrative of decolonization. Let's take India. India is probably the most glaring example. Like I said, already at the time of the events, Mahatma Gandhi's paper, Young India, publishes that 6 million Indians have died of the flu. He published this in early 1919, just using government statistics. The numbers are probably higher. He published this, and in the same episode, they begin talking about the Amritsar massacre. They begin talking about political events. So this is terrible, but there's politics to be done. There's resistance to colonization that needs to be fought. And that's how events happen. Again, Ireland is part of this picture as well when you bring it back to Ireland, right? So there's memory of 1916, whether it's the Somme or it's the Easter Rising, and that'll turn into memory for some of the War of Independence and for others of Northern Ireland. And that overshadows the picture of the epidemic. So we see this, but we see this also. I've looked at various African communities. I've looked at various Asian communities. I've looked at various Indian communities in South America, Central America. You have these traditions which are there. You have songs, you have traditions, but they're also kind of muffled. There isn't a context. It isn't recognized. It's not formal. So,
Hello?
John, we're going to have to silence you there. We're going to have to put you on mute.
Okay.
All right, one sec. John, we need to put you on mute.
Okay, see you soon.
I can't mute him, unfortunately.
All right, John's on mute now. All right, so now let's go back to Europe. There's a very interesting researcher in America called Elizabeth Utka. Elizabeth Utka published a book a year ago called Viral Modernisms. And in Viral Modernisms, she does a new reading of all the great names of modernism, including Yeats, by the way, in Ireland. And she says, once you read them, through what she calls a pandemic lens, you find the pandemic all over there. You begin reading Yeats, knowing that his wife had the flu. You begin restoring the story around, maybe there's influences all over there. Pound, maybe Joyce. You begin looking at everywhere, you begin looking for them. Now, I have a problem with this theory. It's interesting. It's a great exercise, and it shows us that maybe it was far more pervasive. Maybe Western culture actually did register the flu in different ways. But Virginia Woolf is a good example. And I've looked at Virginia Woolf quite closely because Virginia Woolf was sick from the flu. Her relatives were sick from the flu. She was sick from the flu a few times. And then she writes an essay 20 years later saying you can't write literature about the flu. And then she writes Mrs. Dalloway, right? And Mrs. Dalloway is sick from the flu in the book, but it's only in parenthesis. It's not quite there. And that's the whole point here. The whole point is that it's there and it's not there. For the generation that lived through it, they didn't, people say they would have recognized the references to the flu in these books. Would they? There's no evidence that they did recognize the references to the flu. No literary critic picked up on it for 100 years. So it wasn't noticed. Even if it was there, it wasn't there. Again, it's cultural forgetting. Cultural forgetting can be staring you right in the eye, right in the face, and you still don't see it. So there's different reasons why this happens, but the interesting thing for me at the moment, like I said, is how this happens. It was remembered and not remembered. People wrote about it, people registered it, people wrote different pieces on it here and there. In Brazil, the carnival in Rio de Janeiro and in Sao Paulo after the of February 1919 is all about the flu. You can see it, how it appears in the various stands as they parade through the streets. And that's forgotten afterwards. Doesn't turn into part of the folklore of the carnival. So the moment you start digging, you find traces of it everywhere. But this is again cultural forgetting because it doesn't become canonical. The various blocos, the houses of the carnival, have their own traditions, and the flu didn't enter it. It doesn't fit into the pattern.
Hello, everybody. Hello.
Yes, go ahead, John.
I think we should let go.
Lost you there, John. Can't hear you.
Yes, I think he's lost. Right, I think what he's trying to say is that we should maybe let you go. Maybe.
I had a great time. I hope people enjoyed it as well. And it was
thank you very much for coming on, guys. It's very good, and it's much appreciated taking your time out. I know it's very late there in Israel, and we do appreciate it. And we'll put this online in the next couple of days for everybody else to have to watch.
Cut off my political comments from the beginning. Put it online, and I always have time for Reclaimed Enlightenment. It's a great group, and I'll come anytime you invite me. So all the best.
Thank you very much, Night, from everybody here. John, do you want to come on again and try? Are you okay? Or John's away, right? I'll just end up here now. Okay, guys. Thank you again. Cheers.
Bye-bye.
All the best.